This project begins with a few offcuts of English walnuts. Each one is around 2 inches thick and are all leftovers from a chair seat I made back in 2010. And I'm going to make a simple picture frame today with some mitred corners. The idea being to preserve a piece of artwork a friend made for me for my birthday this year. She actually refers to it as a handmade birthday card, but for me it's something more than that. It's sentimental and I'd really like to preserve it. And you can see here how she's already used some kind of plastic laminates backing on either side. But I'd like to do a bit more than that as a woodworker. And here you can see how I'm dimensioning these 2-inch thick boards down into components I can use for a picture frame. They'll be fairly small in sections, so with a bit of careful resawing I can get some almost book mashing going on. But the main focus and idea of this is to get grain continuity around the outside of the frame. If you look carefully at the grain on this wood, you can see that it runs almost perpendicular to the surface at times, and that does make it very difficult to machine. So I'm taking very fine cuts on each of my plating machines in order to avoid breakout and tear out issues. Now back on my rouse table I'm using a 1/4 inch radius round over cutter to shape the inside corners of the front edge of the frame. And this is how I came to determine the overall depth required for my rebate. And on my rouse table I'm cutting a deep rebate using what's known as a tenon cutter. Now it's a bit tricky doing it this way because I'm balancing the wood on the very narrow shaped edge. Now I'm also just using push block and I could have used feather boards, but I worked carefully by increasing the depth of cuts very slightly with each pass, and I got away with it in the end. It seems to work okay. Now to cut these miters for the corner joints, I actually made a jig for my miter saw. That might sound a bit strange, but I'm documenting this in a separate video to be uploaded in a few days. Hopefully that will explain how I made the jig and also why I made the jig. But it works very well in practice. I chose to mount this image to a sheet of black card for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it provides a border around the outside so that in itself gives the artwork some more distinction. But secondly and more importantly, the writing and the image actually butt up close to the edge of the paper, so some of the image would have originally been obscured by the rebase of the frame. And it wasn't easy getting this to glue together because she'd already laminated it with some kind of plastic material, and you can see in a moment how I actually managed to crease it slightly, but it should be okay and the image should be preserved for a very long time. Although I did use masking tape to locate the pictures centrally on the black card, it actually ended up being too tacky and tore some of the black away. With the rebates cut, I could mark out the length of each component and cut the miters to suit. Assembling a mitred frame is never easy. My favourite method has always been to use ratchet straps, as I'm going to do here. But what you can't see in this video is that I've actually pre-assembled two opposite corners here. And to do this I actually used just a bit of masking tape and some glue to kind of hold it all together for half an hour or so before I put the clamps on, as you can see here. But even then, with this ratchet straps in place, as I tightened them, they just kept slipping loose because the material's so thin. It's only about 16mm or 5/8 of an inch. I just kept jumping out the clamps. It took a few goes, but eventually I got there in the end. And if ever any of your own miters have any imperfections like my own, here's a quick little tip for hiding those minor discrepancies. One thing I love about having a bandsaw in my workshop is that I can use the same saw and the same blade to cut many different materials, such as this hardboard backing piece here, and also the 5mm acrylic that I use to protect the front of the picture. Reinforcing these miter joints, which are essentially just end grain to end grain with little strength of their own, I'm using an old technique by cutting these saw slots and I fill them with some oak splines cut on the bandsaw. It looks very simple and maybe very ineffective, but it actually adds a lot of strength to the overlapping glue fibres. On this occasion now I cut them a little bit too tight, so it took a bit of work to get them in there nice and flush and level. Back on the rouse table again, I'm just rounding over the front outer corners and edges of the picture frame. Now it's all assembled. I'm using a larger radius cutter for this one, and it's just a nice way of finishing off the external edges really. Sanding by hand really is the best way to go with this because of the way the grain changes direction and runs almost across the width of the components here. And for the finish I chose to use a hard wax oil, which is one of my favourite finishes. It's very easy to apply and it really does go deep into the grain and it brings out the real beauty within the wood. Just let it sit for a few minutes and then buff away the excess. And also gave it a good buffing in between coats as well to help bring out the shine. What I'm doing here is I'm wet sanding the timber and the oil using some 400 grit fine abrasive paper. It's a good way of getting the oil in finish into all the little pores, all the crevices in the wood, especially on something open grained, something with difficult grain like this walnut here. And finally it was time to fit the pieces into the frame and to assemble everything. Of course, not forgetting a special little note she wrote to me personally. It'll stay buried in here forever. I'm going to use screws to attach this back panel, where traditionally you would use very small pins. I find that pins are very tricky to remove, and even without a pilot hole, these Phillips head screws go in so easily. And the best part is, I think, I can easily take them out again if I need to. Because there is, I must admit, there is some dust left on the acrylic cover on the inside face actually. So when I want to get in there and clean that off, or to read my secret note again, I can just do that very easily with a small screwdriver bit. Thank you all for watching this video. Please like and subscribe here on YouTube, and I'll see you again soon.